They thought she was just the fat girl pouring coffee on the night shift. They thought the concrete pillars of the underground garage would muffle the screams of the city's most ruthless boss. They were wrong on both counts. Sometimes the deadliest weapon is the one nobody bothers looking at. Sullivan's Diner sat on the edge of the industrial district in South Boston, a greasy neon beacon in a sea of darkened warehouses. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of hour where the only people awake were cops, drunks, and people running from one or the other. Bridget was none of those. She was just tired. At 280 pounds, Bridget carried her weight with a solid, unapologetic groundedness. She was undeniably fat, her thick thighs chafing under the cheap polyester of her pink Waitress uniform, her broad shoulders aching from carrying trays of heavy ceramic plates. Society had a funny way of treating fat women in service jobs. They rendered them completely invisible. Customers looked right through her, talking over her as if she were a piece of the furniture, a human-shaped coffee dispenser. Bridget didn't mind the invisibility. In fact, she depended on it. She was wiping down booth 4, her sturdy arms scrubbing at a dried smear of ketchup, when the diner bell chimed. The cold October wind blew in, carrying the scent of impending rain and ozone, followed by a man who fundamentally did not belong in Sullivan's. He was tall, broad-chested, and moving with a stiff, calculated grace that immediately screamed injury. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, the kind that cost more than Bridget made in 3 years. But the left side of his jacket was ruined by a dark, wet stain that looked black under the flickering fluorescent lights. Gabriel Rossi. Bridget didn't gasp. She didn't drop her rag. She recognized him instantly, though they had never met. Anyone who grew up in the rougher parishes of Boston knew the Rossi family, and Gabriel was the newly crowned head of the syndicate. He was ruthless, notoriously private, and currently bleeding out in her diner. Gabriel slid into the furthest corner booth, his back to the wall, his dark eyes scanning the room. The diner was empty, save for an old trucker asleep at the counter, and Jimmy, the fry cook, who was blasting rock music in the kitchen, completely oblivious. Bridget walked over, pulling her order pad from her apron. She didn't stare at the blood. She didn't stare at the heavy bulge of the 9mm tucked into his waistband, which was barely concealed by his ruined jacket. "Coffee?" she asked. Her voice was flat, carrying the thick, working-class vowels of her neighborhood. Gabriel looked up. His face was striking, sharp jaw, dark stubble, pale skin currently slick with a sheen of cold sweat. "Black. Leave the pot. You need some ice for that." Bridget gestured with her pen toward his ribs. "Or a mop." His eyes narrowed, flashing with a sudden, dangerous intensity. He was used to people cowering. He was not used to a heavy-set, exhausted waitress treating his gunshot wound like a spilled milkshake. "Just the coffee." Bridget nodded, turned on her thick, rubber-soled shoes, and waddled back to the counter. As she poured the boiling brew into a carafe, she glanced out the grease-stained front window. A matte black Lincoln Navigator had just rolled to a slow stop across the street. The headlights cut out. The engine stayed running. Bridget felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in 6 years. 6 years since she left her father's underground fighting rings. 6 years since she walked away from a life of breaking bones and collecting debts for the Irish mobs on the South Side. Back then, they called her the Boulder. She didn't have the lean, sculpted muscles of a cinematic martial artist. She had raw mass, terrifying momentum, and a mastery of close-quarters combat that utilized every pound of her frame as a weapon. She grabbed the coffee pot and walked back to Gabriel's booth. She set it down heavily. "You got company across the street," Bridget said quietly, not looking at him, pretending to wipe the edge of the table. "4 in the SUV, probably 2 more in the alley by the way they're boxing the block." Gabriel's hand instinctively drifted toward his waistband. He finally looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw a fat woman with messy brown hair tied in a scrunchie, flushed cheeks, and a stained apron. And yet her eyes were dead calm. Tactical. "Is there a back exit?" Gabriel rasped, wincing as he shifted his weight. "Through the kitchen. Leads to the alley. But if you cross the alley, you hit the B2 level of the municipal parking garage. It's a concrete maze down there. Dead end if you don't have a car." "I have a car on B2, Gabriel said, his breathing shallow. He pulled a crumpled, blood-stained $100 bill from his pocket and tossed it on the table. "Forget you saw me." "I already did," Bridget said, pocketing the bill. Gabriel stood, clutching his side, and limped past the counter, shoving through the swinging doors into the kitchen. Bridget watched the front window. The doors of the Lincoln opened. 5 men stepped out. They were wearing dark jackets, carrying suppressed weapons down by their sides. They were professionals. The O'Connor crew, most likely, making a play for the city by taking out Rossi while he was isolated. Bridget stood there for a long moment. She looked at the clock. 2:15 a.m. Her shift wasn't over for another 4 hours. She thought about her quiet life, her tiny apartment, her cat. She thought about how much she hated the smell of blood. Then she thought about the fact that Gabriel Rossi was limping, bleeding, and walking straight into a bottleneck in the parking garage against 5 armed killers. He wouldn't make it to his car. "Hey, Jimmy," Bridget called out over the sound of the deep fryer. "Yeah, Bridge," Jimmy yelled back from the grill. "I'm taking the trash out. Might take a minute." Bridget walked to the back door. She unclipped her heavy brass keyring from her belt. It held about 20 keys on a thick, braided steel lanyard. She wrapped the lanyard around her thick wrist, the brass keys settling into her palm like a jagged makeshift set of brass knuckles. She pushed the heavy steel door open and stepped out into the damp, freezing night. The underground municipal parking garage on level B2 smelled of stagnant water, old motor oil, and exhaust. The fluorescent tube lights overhead buzzed angrily, half of them flickering and casting long, strobe-like shadows against the damp concrete pillars. Gabriel Rossi was dying. He knew it, and he hated it. He had survived assassination attempts, hostile takeovers, and federal indictments, and now he was going to bleed out next to a rusted Honda Civic because he took a hollow point to the ribs in a back-alley ambush. He leaned heavily against a concrete pillar, struggling to pull air into his burning lungs. His armored Mercedes was 50 yards away, but it might as well have been on the moon. Footsteps echoed off the concrete, heavy, deliberate, and closing in from a fan formation. "Rossi!" a voice barked. The acoustics of the garage amplified the taunt. "It's over, Gabe. O'Connor sends his regards." Gabriel pulled his 9mm, gritting his teeth. 5 men stepped out from behind the parked cars, boxing him in. The leader was a scarred brute named Fitzpatrick, a known enforcer for the O'Connor syndicate. They had him cornered. Gabriel raised his gun, firing 2 quick shots. He clipped one man in the shoulder, sending him spinning to the pavement, but the recoil tore agonizingly at his rib wound. Before Gabriel could readjust his aim, Fitzpatrick lunged from his blind spot, swinging a heavy steel tire iron. The metal cracked against Gabriel's wrist, shattering bone and sending his gun clattering across the asphalt. Gabriel fell to his knees, gasping in pain, clutching his shattered wrist. The 4 remaining men closed in, kicking his gun away. Fitzpatrick smiled, raising the tire iron. "Nothing personal, Rossi." "Well, maybe a little personal." Suddenly, the heavy metal fire door of the adjacent alleyway slammed open, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the garage. The men spun around, raising their weapons. Bridget stood in the doorway. She hadn't bothered to take off her pink waitress apron. In the dim light of the parking garage, her massive silhouette blocked the frame. She didn't look like a savior. She looked like someone who had taken a wrong turn on the way to the dumpster. Fitzpatrick laughed, lowering his weapon slightly. "Get lost, lady, before you get hurt." Bridget didn't say a word. She began to walk forward. She didn't jog. She didn't sprint. She walked with a terrifying, rhythmic purpose, her thick legs eating up the distance, her center of gravity low and rooted. "I said back off, Shamu," one of the thugs yelled, stepping forward to shove her. That was his first and last mistake. The man reached out to push her broad chest. Bridget didn't step back. Instead, she stepped into him. She used her 280 pounds of mass, driving her shoulder squarely into his sternum, while her thick hand shot up, grabbing the back of his neck. Physics is a harsh mistress. Mass times acceleration equals force. Bridget pivoted on her heavy, rubber-soled shoes, using the thug's own forward momentum against him. She dragged his head down and brought her knee up in a vicious, perfectly timed strike. The sickening crunch of his face flattening against her knee echoed through the garage. She let go, and he dropped to the concrete like a sack of wet cement, completely unconscious. The remaining 3 men froze, their brains failing to compute what had just happened. The fat waitress had just dropped a 200-pound mob enforcer in less than a second. "Shoot her!" Fitzpatrick screamed. The man closest to Bridget raised his pistol. Bridget was already moving. People always assumed fat meant slow. They didn't understand that a heavy object in motion stays in motion. She lunged, slapping the barrel of the gun outward with her left forearm, just as it fired, the bullet pinging harmlessly off a concrete pillar. Before the man could pull the trigger again, Bridget brought her right hand around in a devastating hook. The heavy brass keys wrapped around her fist acted like a medieval flail. The jagged metal tore across the man's jaw, shattering teeth and splitting his cheek wide open. He screamed, dropping the gun. Bridget grabbed him by the lapels of his jacket, hoisted him slightly off his feet, and threw his entire body weight backwards into the front grille of a parked Ford pickup. The truck's alarm blared to life, adding a deafening siren to the chaos. 2 down, 2 left. Gabriel watched from his knees, his vision swimming, his mouth open in pure shock. This wasn't a fight. This was a demolition. Fitzpatrick and the last remaining thug rushed her simultaneously, abandoning their guns in the tight quarters, pulling hunting knives from their belts. "Cut her!" Fitzpatrick roared. Bridget widened her stance. This was where her Timmers was her greatest asset. She was an immovable object. As the first thug lunged, thrusting the knife at her stomach, Bridget didn't suck it in or try to dodge. She caught his wrist with a grip like a bench vise. She twisted her hips, driving her substantial weight downward, hyperextending his elbow over her thick forearm. The joint popped with a loud snap. The man shrieked, dropping the knife. Bridget didn't let him go. She used him as a human shield, shoving his body directly into Fitzpatrick's path. Fitzpatrick tripped over his own man, stumbling forward. Bridget stepped over the groaning thug on the floor. She reached down, grabbed Fitzpatrick by the back of his leather jacket and his belt, and utilized a textbook judo throw, heavily modified for a street brawl. She lifted him using her powerful tree-trunk thighs and slammed him head first into the concrete pillar Gabriel was leaning against. Fitzpatrick crumpled, a smear of blood leaving a trail down the pillar as he slid to the floor, out cold. Silence descended on the B2 parking level, broken only by the wailing of the truck alarm and the heavy, rhythmic sound of Bridget breathing. She stood in the center of the carnage. 4 men were scattered around her, groaning or completely comatose. She hadn't broken a sweat, though a thin line of blood was dripping from a small cut on her cheek where a key had caught her. She calmly reached up, wiped the blood away with her thumb, and looked down at Gabriel Rossi. Gabriel stared up at her. The city's most feared Mafia boss, a man who had seen some of the most brutal violence the underworld had to offer, was utterly speechless. He looked at her stained pink apron, her scuffed shoes, and the absolute terrifying deadness in her eyes. "You," Gabriel breathed, his chest heaving, his broken wrist cradled against his stomach. "Who the hell are you?" Bridget reached down, her thick fingers picking up his fallen 9mm. She wiped the grip on her apron and handed it back to him, grip first. "I'm Bridget," she said, her voice flat, sounding exactly like a woman who was tired of being on her feet all night. "I'm your waitress. Now get up, Mr. Rossi. You're bleeding on my tip money." Gabriel's knees buckled the moment Bridget hauled him upright. He hissed, a sharp intake of air through clenched teeth as the shattered bones in his left wrist ground together. Bridget didn't flinch. She slid her thick right arm around his waist, wedging her shoulder firmly under his right armpit. At 280 pounds, her body was a solid, immovable anchor against his fading strength. She smelled of stale fryer grease, heavy-duty industrial soap, and the faint, bitter edge of dark roast coffee. Against her, Gabriel's ruined charcoal suit reeked of copper, burnt gunpowder, and the cold sweat of a body going into clinical shock. "Which car?" Bridget asked, her voice a low rumble in the quiet of the underground garage. "Black Mercedes S-Class. End of the row," Gabriel managed to grit out. Bridget practically carried him. Her heavy rubber-soled shoes squeaked against the damp concrete, echoing off the low ceiling. She didn't struggle with his weight. Her broad back and thick thighs were built for heavy labor, a residual byproduct of her years collecting debts in the grimier wards of Southie. She reached the Mercedes, a heavy, armored tank of a vehicle, and jammed her thick fingers into Gabriel's uninjured right pocket to retrieve the fob. The car beeped, the headlights flashing against the concrete wall. She opened the passenger door, shoved him inside with more efficiency than gentleness, and slammed the heavy door shut. The thud of the armored door sealing them in cut off the wailing alarm of the truck she had dented earlier. Bridget walked around the hood and squeezed into the driver's seat. The bolstered leather bucket seats were designed for a much narrower frame. Her wide hips pressed tightly against the center console, and her thick thighs spilled over the edges of the cushion. She didn't care. She adjusted the rear-view mirror with a broad, calloused hand, pushed the ignition button, and the massive V12 engine purred to life with a deep, vibrating hum. "Where to?" she asked, throwing the car into drive. "North End," Gabriel wheezed, his head lolling against the cold window glass. "Avoid the O'Neill Tunnel camera clusters. Take surface streets, Commercial Street, Warehouse 42, Dr. Declan Harrington." Bridget nodded, recognizing the name. Harrington was a former trauma surgeon at Mass General Hospital, whose license got quietly revoked a decade ago over missing narcotics. Now, He was the highest-paid private fixer in the New England underworld. If you had the cash, Harrington could pull a bullet out of your liver without ever generating a police report. Mentioning Harrington was as real and private as the mob life got. She steered the heavy Mercedes out of the garage, the tires splashing through a deep puddle as they hit the street level. October rain had started to fall, heavy and freezing, slapping against the reinforced windshield. The drive was silent save for the rhythmic thumping of the wipers and Gabriel's shallow, wet breathing. The interior of the car was climate-controlled, smelling of expensive leather conditioning and the rising metallic tang of Gabriel's blood soaking into the passenger seat. "You fought for the Sullivan brothers," Gabriel said suddenly, his voice raspy. His dark eyes were half closed, observing her profile in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "6 years ago," Bridget replied, keeping her eyes on the slick asphalt of Dorchester Avenue. "They called you the Boulder." Gabriel swallowed hard, shifting his injured ribs. "I heard you broke Liam O'Connor's femurs because he shorted a poker payout." "I broke one femur. The other fractured when he hit the pavement," Bridget corrected flatly. "And I quit because breaking bones for a living ruins your knees. Waitressing pays less, but nobody shoots at me. Until tonight." "Why did you step in?" he asked. The question hung heavily in the cold air of the cabin. A man in Gabriel's position knew that nobody did anything for free. He expected a hustle. He expected a demand for money. Bridget gripped the steering wheel, her thick knuckles turning white. "You were going to bleed out next to a rusted Civic, and Fitzpatrick is a scumbag who hits women. He cracked my jaw 5 years ago. I owed him a concussion." Gabriel let out a short, painful bark of a laugh that ended in a wet cough. He looked at her, really looked at her. Society conditioned men to look past fat women, to deem them invisible, useless, or pathetic. Gabriel saw a fortress. He saw a woman who possessed more raw, kinetic combat efficiency than his entire security detail. They pulled onto Commercial Street, the rain coming down in blinding sheets. Bridget spotted Warehouse 42, an unassuming brick building with rusted iron shutters. She pulled the Mercedes into the narrow alleyway behind it, the proximity sensors flatlining as she scraped the armored bumper against a dumpster to wedge the car into the shadows. "We're here," Bridget said, throwing the car into park. The interior of Harrington's warehouse was a stark contrast to the decaying brick exterior. Behind a heavy steel vault door lay a pristine, brightly lit surgical suite that smelled sharply of bleach, iodine, and surgical spirit. Dr. Declan Harrington, a gaunt man with shaking hands that miraculously steadied the moment he picked up a scalpel, didn't ask questions. He took one look at Gabriel, yelled for his assistant, and had him on a stainless steel gurney in seconds. Bridget stood in the corner of the room. She was dripping wet, her pink polyester uniform clinging to her heavy frame, her thick arms crossed over her stomach. She watched silently as Harrington took medical shears and cut away the ruined Armani suit. The sound of tearing fabric and the wet squelch of blood-soaked cotton hitting the linoleum floor filled the sterile room. Harrington pumped Gabriel full of local anesthetics. "Rib is cracked, bullet grazed the intercostal muscle. You're lucky, Rossi. An inch to the left and it would have clipped your lung. Wrist is pulverized, though. I have to set it with pins." Gabriel gritted his teeth, his pale skin slick with sweat under the harsh surgical lights. "Just do it." Bridget moved to a small sink in the corner, turning on the faucet. She pumped coarse industrial soap into her broad hands, scrubbing Fitzpatrick's dried blood out from under her fingernails. The running water masked the sound of the heavy steel vault door at the front of the clinic clicking open. Bridget felt the shift in air pressure before she heard the footsteps. She turned off the faucet. The silence that followed was broken by the sharp, metallic clack of a round being chambered. A man stood in the doorway of the surgical suite. He wore a damp tan trench coat over a tailored navy suit. He held a suppressed Glock 19, the barrel pointed directly at the surgical gurney. Gabriel's eyes snapped open. Despite the painkillers clouding his system, sheer rage cut through the haze. Leo Cavallo, Gabriel's underboss, the man who had managed Gabriel's schedule for the last 5 years. "Sorry, Gabe," Leo said, his voice smooth, completely devoid of remorse. "Fitzpatrick and the O'Connor crew were a blunt instrument. I knew they'd probably mess it up at the diner, but they flushed you out. And I knew you'd come to Harrington." Harrington froze, his hands in the air, a bloodied pair of forceps dangling from his fingers. "Leo, come on. No business in the clinic. You know the rules." "Rules change when management changes, Declan," Leo said, stepping fully into the room. He kept his eyes locked on Gabriel. He didn't even glance at the corner of the room. He didn't look at the fat waitress in the wet pink uniform. That was his fatal error. Bridget didn't announce herself. She didn't yell to draw his attention. She operated purely on the cold, brutal mechanics of survival. Her eyes locked onto a heavy, steel-framed oxygen cylinder strapped to a wheeled medical cart next to the sink. Leo raised the Glock, aiming at Gabriel's chest. "It's nothing personal, boss. The New York families just want a more compliant partner." As Leo's finger tightened on the trigger, Bridget kicked the wheel of the medical cart with the heel of her heavy shoe. The cart spun outward, directly into Leo's peripheral vision. Startled, Leo flinched, jerking the gun toward the sudden movement. The suppressed weapon let out a muted thwip, the bullet burying itself in the drywall inches from Bridget's head. Bridget was already moving. 280 pounds of muscle and mass, launching forward with terrifying explosive acceleration. Before Leo could swing the barrel back, Bridget slammed into him. She didn't try to punch him. She used her entire body as a battering ram. Her heavy shoulder collided squarely with his sternum. The impact sounded like a car crash. The air was violently expelled from Leo's lungs in a wet gasp. His feet left the floor. He flew backward, crashing hard against a heavy stainless steel storage cabinet, shattering the glass doors. The Glock spun out of his hand, skittering across the linoleum. Leo crumbled to the floor, gasping for breath, grasping at his crushed chest. He reached desperately for a shard of broken glass. Bridget didn't give him the chance to recover. She stepped forward, her thick leg rising, and drove the heel of her rubber-soled shoe directly down onto his kneecap. The bone shattered with a sickening crunch that echoed off the tiled walls. Leo let out a blood-curdling scream, curling into a fetal position on the floor, surrounded by broken glass and medical supplies. Bridget stood over him, her chest heaving slightly. The cut on her cheek from the parking garage had reopened, a fresh line of red dripping down her jaw. She looked down at the traitorous underboss with absolute, chilling apathy. She turned around and picked up the suppressed Glock from the floor. Her thick fingers wrapped around the grip, making the weapon look small. She walked over to the surgical gurney and set the gun down on Gabriel's uninjured chest. Gabriel stared at her. The pain in his ribs and wrist was completely eclipsed by the raw, staggering reality of the woman standing over him. She had just dismantled an armed, trained mob assassin in less than 3 seconds, using nothing but her sheer size and kinetic intuition. Harrington was pressed against the far wall, pale and shaking. "Christ almighty," the doctor whispered. Bridget reached into the deep pocket of her pink apron and pulled out the blood-stained $100 bill Gabriel had thrown at her, back at the diner. She tossed it onto the metal tray next to the surgical tools. "Coffee was $2, Bridget said, her heavy Southie accent cutting through the sterile smell of the room. "Keep the change. I'm going home. My cat needs feeding." She turned and began to walk heavily toward the exit. "Bridget!" Gabriel called out, his voice hoarse. She paused, looking over her broad shoulder. Gabriel picked up the Glock with his right hand. He didn't point it at her, he rested it on his stomach. He looked at her stained uniform, her messy hair, and the imposing, magnificent bulk of her frame. He didn't see a waitress. He saw the future of his syndicate's survival. "The diner pays what? 15 an hour?" Gabriel asked. 12, she corrected. "I need a new head of personal security," Gabriel said, glancing down at the groaning, broken man on the floor. "And I need someone who doesn't mind breaking femurs. I'll pay you 10,000 a week. Cash." Bridget looked at the door. She thought about the smell of old fryer oil. She thought about the invisible life she had been living. Then she looked back at Gabriel Rossi, bleeding on the table, offering her a throne built on concrete and broken bones. A slow, grim smile spread across Bridget's wide face. "I'll need a tailored suit," Bridget said, her voice dropping an octave. "And they don't sell my size off the rack. Did this intense Mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat?" The Boston underworld is brutal, but Bridget proved that the most dangerous weapon is the one nobody expects. If you loved this gritty, real-life story of survival, betrayal, and an unlikely bond, hit that like button right now. Share this video with fellow drama lovers, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more dark, thrilling Mafia storytelling every single week.